So this is the day that Boris Johnson is making his first bid to transform himself into Winston Churchill. If the contents of the front pages of the Fleet Street papers are to be believed, this is part B of the Khudilar television channel being broadcast from London in the United Kingdom on Thursday, the 6th of May, 2021. This is 10:16 hours GMT, that is 16 minutes past 10 in the morning in London on Thursday, the 6th of May, 2021. As stated in the previous part A, which was timed approximately at 2:02 hours GMT, we shall be continuing covering what is going on in the so-called local elections in England. Parts of the local elections, not all the councillor posts are up for election, but half of them roughly. And in the case of the two boroughs in East London, in London's East End or East of London or East London, the boroughs of Tower Hamlets and Newham. These boroughs are having a referendum each about the current post in each of the boroughs of elected mayor. Now, it is important to emphasize that the concept of elected mayors was new, is new to the UK. It was introduced by the regime that was fronted by Tony Blair. And it is absolutely the case that Tony Blair was inspired by his general anti-democratic propensities. So he introduced the Mayor of London and made provision for local boroughs to have mayors. And this is a menace to democracy. But reading the so-called Fleet Street newspapers, it is never possible to see any link between this post and the concept of democracy, which is absolutely vital, no matter how fragile and how imperfect the reality of the democracy in operation is. And the fact that the mayor system was brought about by Tony Blair must not be seen only as Blair's anti-democratic propensities producing that measure. In fact, for the previous 15 years or so, prior to the 2000 Act that actually makes provision for the imposition of mayor, the former Labour leader of the Greater London Council, or the GLC, Ken Lying Still Livingstone. Lying still is our additional adjective for him, original adjective, because of his lying. Now, Ken Lying Still Livingstone effectively treated the post of the leader of the Greater London Council, which he was, as a de facto dictatorial post. So when Margaret Thatcher abolished the GLC, Ken Lying Still Livingstone wanted the GLC to be revived, not necessarily literally in every respect, but essentially in a way that would give him another platform. Now, Ken Lying Still Livingstone is a narcissist, egotist. Narcissist, egotist who can be compared to India's narcissist, egotist Narendra Modi. Of course, Modi was far from being anywhere near power at that time in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher in Britain scrapped the Greater London Council. Now, I witnessed all of that. And as you know, anyone carefully watching this program, previous editions, can find and will recall. I played a unique part in exposing Ken Lying Still Livingstone as an anti-democratic, corrupt opportunist. I did that by actively, physically attending several hundred events over a number of years held in the so-called county hall, and raising questions, hundreds of questions, directly challenging Ken Lying Still Livingstone's various claims at those events. And this is a summary of what I did. This particular edition, I'm going to do the summary. And in more cases than not, because of my interventions and questions directly put to Ken Lying Still Livingstone, in front of his invited audiences, who had no idea, most of the times, because each event was a new one with new sets of people most of the times. So I would think that most of those people personally didn't know my locus or who I was, because they were from outside of the GLC and outside of the Inner London Education Authority, which was a part of the GLC formally, but effectively the Inner London Education Authority was itself a very big organization. In fact, it was the biggest single education authority in all of Europe at the time. So the GLC was abolished in the middle of 1980s, and the Inner London Education Authority was abolished, phased. There was a phased abolition because of the various logistical involvement in terms of the schools across Inner London. So the Inner London Education Authority was abolished, let's say, few years after the GLC was abolished. And what happened in the process of the GLC being abolished was that Ken Lying Still Livingstone decided to continue to agitate against Margaret Thatcher. And within the Labour Party and the trade unions, lying still, Livingstone continued to lobby various factions in the party for the revival of the Greater London Council in some form. Now, after the GLC was abolished, I didn't have that kind of connection to directly interact or challenge Ken Livingstone's assertions. And I said that my experience and evidence confirm that Livingstone was wrong in proposing or making the assertions that he was making, which I was challenging every time I was there. I missed hardly any of the events. And my mission was to democratically assert the demands for questions and evidence, to test the veracity and sincerity of Ken Lying Still Livingstone, which Ken Lying Still Livingstone completely and utterly failed to deliver. As I have said before, my campaigning approach has always been prompted by and dependent on and produced by my total commitment, absolute commitment to ethical, moral values and principles of the highest possible standard. And I say that on the record because I know that the proceedings of the United Nations and its various agencies, for example, and other international bodies don't match the standards that I have followed and I do follow. And because I don't make up the questions, I always rely on the evidence and the test and veracity of the evidence that I base my questions and challenges on. My questions are never capable of being answered by anyone who is not familiar with the ethical and moral criteria and standard that I follow. And Ken Lying Still Livingstone was never going to be able to answer my questions. It doesn't matter, or it didn't matter, what particular aspect my questions covered. Remember, I started asking questions in the very year 1981. The very year 1981, because it was May. This is May. And the first week of May, 1st of May, I think, 1981, you can check that. The Labour Party replaced the Conservative Party as the controlling group on the Greater London Council. And the Conservatives were fronted until that May 1981 election, GLC election. The Conservatives were fronted by a man called Horace Cutler. Now, Horace Cutler was a typical Conservative Londoner, I think. And he was dim. He didn't have a vision for London. He didn't have a democratic vision. He had no commitment for social cohesion or inclusivity or diversity, let alone any commitment to end disparity, discrimination, most certainly not racism. And Horace Cutler and his cabal became our targets for campaigning, during the 70s because it coincided with the two racist murders of two Bangladeshis, one in Tower Hamlets and one in Hackney. The Tower Hamlets one happened in May 1978, and the one in Hackney happened in July 1978. So the one in Tower Hamlets affected the victim, Altab Ali, and the one in Hackney affected the victim, Ishaq Ali. And I was mobilizing right from the beginning, immediately after the racists murdered Altab Ali. Now, these are the short kind of timeline that I'm going through. I'm not getting involved in discussing each segment or each time or each date. So what happened with the racist murders in 78 was that the Bangladeshi community politically was capable of being mobilized in a way that had not happened before, because it was an existential series of threats, people getting murdered by racists. So it was not difficult compared to many other issues. It was not difficult to get across the message that the community's very existence, safety was at stake. So the people were capable of being mobilized more easily to support anti-racist actions and activities. And a significant number of those activities involve the question of housing. And the neglect by the GLC of the housing needs. And in the 1970s, as I was saying in the first part again today, the migration from Silot into Tower Hamlets, let's say, witnessed a surge. Started during the 60s, but the surge became quite significant in the 70s. Thus, the demand and the need for housing was significantly higher than it had been the case in this area previously. And because of the racist status quo in allowing access to housing, access to jobs as well, but jobs compared to now, jobs were better available at that time, but the housing wasn't. And the GLC was, on the evidence, identified as one of the obstacles and deniers of service, housing service, at every level. So that campaign actually helped, our campaign helped the narrative, the electoral narrative, the canvassing, the campaigning, and the arguments. Just as happened in the USA during the election last year, presidential election, significant contributions, electoral, psephological contributions were made by dedicated members of the Black community in the USA, African origin mainly, but including other background, people of Asian backgrounds as well. We shall not talk about the original nations, what is called the American Indians, because their commentary is different because of historical reasons. So we will leave that for another time. Now, What has happened with the surge in activities after the racist murders, especially of George Floyd, and the emergence of the networking outfit, Black Lives Matter, is that people have actually gone out of their way to mobilize as many people as they could to use the franchise, the vote, to get rid of Donald Trump. Now, that is how it happened. It wasn't like the people voting for Joe Biden, it was the voting against Donald Trump. Remember the equation, remember the comparison. Just like happened in May 2005, when we got rid of Una King from Bethnal Green and Bow. It wasn't a vote for George Galloway, it was a vote against Una King. And we were determined to get rid of her as an MP because she had defied the community and challenged us. She had said that she would vote against the Palestinians. And if the people didn't like it, then they could use their vote to get rid of her, which is exactly what we did. And the kind of beneficiary was, of course, personally, George Galloway. So back to the GLC, and when we exposed the conservatives, GLC, as the people responsible for the racist policies on housing, this created unprecedented momentum against the conservatives. And it affected people voting. So we created that. Now, Livingstone, of course, being a liar, he was in denial of the role that obviously I had played in mobilizing the community into our hamlets, but also the role that other people had played about the same kind of issues. But the power in our narrative was based on the campaign that I organized against the racist murders. So when the election took place and the Labour group led by Andrew McIntosh won the election, GLC election, and ousted the Conservatives, it was expected, widely expected, that the newly elected Labour group as the controlling group on the GLC would deliver on the promises it had made and deliver on the demands that we had made. Again, I will not go into the details of those because this particular edition, I'm going to go on to discuss the voting that is taking place today over the elected mayor post in Tower Hamlets and in Newham. But I'm going into that with a background of evidential kind of narrative coming from the experience of the GLC. Now, GLC then was hijacked. The group that won the election was divided by Ken Livingstone into one faction that supported him and the other faction that supported Andrew McIntosh. Now, I never had any personal contact with McIntosh, but on purely ethical and moral principles, I have always argued since 1981. So it is 40 years I've been arguing for justice for Andrew McIntosh and for Ken Livingstone to be held to account for lying and betraying and toppling him. not because I ideologically agreed with many of the things that Andrew McIntosh did or stood for, but on a basis of fairness, I believe that Andrew McIntosh should have been given due credit for leading the Labour group into victory. And he should have been given reasonable, courteous recognition and treatment and chance to at least stay as leader of the GLC for at least a reasonable time. But Livingstone and his co-criminals and plotters didn't know any morality, any ethics, any courtesy, any generosity. So they removed McIntosh as the leader within 24 hours, which is why I have been calling for 40 years, I've been describing their attack as a coup. It's a grotesque coup. They didn't have to replace him. And I'll tell you why. Because if they were dedicated to the different set of policies, then they could have done that. They could have pursued the same policies that they wanted to be pursued by the GLC by a majority voting, because that is what the GLC structure was like. It wasn't a dictatorial mayor system. It is the leader of the group and the ordinary members of the GLC were entitled to votes and give opinion and whatever. They didn't do that. And I was there because I was there immediately in the first week of May, within day or 2 days of the election, because I was absolutely determined to see everything that the GLC under the Labour banner did or would do. I have always been giving priority to evidence and ethics and morality, not my career. Anyone watching this for the first time must understand that I could have become all those various things, ministers, this, that, and the others, various places. I said no. And I never belonged to any faction. Not because I didn't have offers. I did have offers. But I rejected all factions when I found that they were prioritizing opportunities, careers, and corruption, and so on, in various degrees, as opposed to serving the people. That never happened. So I serially have said no. That has meant that I have not had the material kind of benefits that would have been available over a very long time if I had said yes, and if I had ignored the lying and corruption and machinations. But at the GLC, what they did, what the coup meisters began to do in 1981 was to abuse their win against McIntosh and they're called the right wing. I believe on the evidence of the Labour Party's history, the difference between right wing and left wing is exaggerated on the evidence, not ideologically. Ideologically, there are different concepts and proposals, but in practice, the priority should be to deliver what is called the universal services, which cannot be affected by right wing or left wing. So right wing and left wing became the main kind of banner for the liars led by or misled by Ken Livingstone. Because I have dealt with all the various factions in the GLC. I dealt with them. Let's say starting from the May 1981 up to the abolition of the GLC. Well, it is quite obvious that none of them had my abilities or understanding or outlook, and I didn't expect them to have anything similar to mine. That would be unrealistic. But I did expect them to have basic honesty and decency and courtesy, which they failed to deliver. At various levels, I interacted with them about the people on the ground every time. Every time the long discussions were followed by my question, what are you doing on housing? What are you doing on this and the other? Whatever the GLC's remits were. Same thing happened with the Inner London Education Authority. And I found that the people who were imposed as leader of the ILEA or the chair of a committee, either on the GLC or the ILEA, they were incapable of answering the question. Remember, that is what I did with Livingstone. I mean, I would say that I interrupted or disrupted about 250 to 300 separate events that Ken Livingstone, Livingstone, was trying to exploit for promoting his narcissist, egotistic agenda. And he blamed me for destroying most of his efforts. Well, I don't plead guilty at all, because I was doing the moral, the ethical, the democratic, transparent, absolutely transparent, universal things. And if I didn't do that, nobody else would be doing this. Nobody from any background would be doing this. And the difficulty with the likes of Ken Livingstone is that they don't have the morality and the ethics and the depth or the width of the vision that should prevail, but didn't prevail. So when there was this lobbying by Livingstone to create something like the GLC in London, I don't think Tony Blair had any idea what he was doing when he allowed that mayoral system to be legislated and provided for. As Blair has now admitted, or Blair, in the past month, when he went into Downing Street, he was not prepared, he was not fit. He admitted now, 20 years, 24 years later. But we knew that. I started calling him Blair in 1997, immediately, shortly after his election. Because I was looking at the evidence of his utterances and his behavior and his various stunts, and I knew that he was out of his depth. Now, it's one thing to say 20 years later that he didn't know what he was letting himself in for. But I knew that he was not fit. And so when he gave the kind of green light to the legislation that allowed for the creation of this directly elected mayor, Ken Livingstone must have been, privately at least, gobsmacked with disbelief, because he couldn't have expected that whole provision. And the package of legislation I'm speaking as a very long-standing constitutional law expert, to use an expressive expression. And I've been doing it since way before Tony Blair left his fat school in Edinburgh, primary school or whatever. The point is that democracy, as I was saying in part one about Churchill didn't get the core of democracy right. He had a general kind of idea, but he didn't get the core right. Democracy is not the election. As the coup meisters, fronted by Ken Livingstone, coup meisters who mobilized and executed the coup against Andrew Mackintosh, proved in 1981, in May 1981, exactly 40 years ago this month. This week, first week of May. Democracy is not the election itself. Democracy is after the election and until the next election. And the heat must be put on the electeds to deliver. And the heat must come from outside. The heat must come from sources without any vested interest. And I have been doing this for as long as I have been doing it. I don't do it because at the end of the process, there will be some benefit for me. Well, I've been offered jobs, many points in time, many points. And I said, look, I can't take the job because that would be so demonstrably corrupt, even if I am not a crook. But that would be completely compromising all the morality that I stand on. So I'd rather go without a lot of things than I would take a position. That is what I do. And the evidence shows that I have been absolutely correct, because if I had taken any of those offers, I would have stopped the momentum. I would have stopped the flow. I would have stopped the actual movement. And every movement I have done, every campaign I have done, and I do, shows that I have been correct to stick to the values and the principles. Otherwise, the result would be non-existent. For example, I spent a good number of years in defending the 40 persons who were arrested on Saturday, the 15th of July, 1989, in the Bethnal Green Road, while protesting against the level of police inactivity following the murderous attack on Ismat Ali and his relative Watir Ali. Both of them died, but Watir Ali suffered longer because he was in hospital before he died, but Ismat Ali died instantly during the attack that took place on the 9th of July, 1989. Now, it is absolutely unbelievable that I got all 40 of them off the charges. Well, they went through the court and they were prosecuted, but they were all acquitted. I did that. It's not a joke. To get one person acquitted of a criminal charge is remarkable. And while I was doing that, I had no access to resources that would have been available to somebody, a licensed law trading office or operation. I didn't have an office. I didn't have anything. I didn't have any library in terms of being able to refer to things and search for things and research the things. So I did that by various actions that I had to do. And I demonstrated, which is significant, I demonstrated outside courts, solo demonstrations. I didn't have even one person to hold the other side of the banner. That is how desperate and stark the work was. And I didn't have I had no need to do that personally, because it wasn't anything to do with me personally. So if I didn't do that, how many of the 40 persons that were arrested and prosecuted would have been acquitted? I cannot say now. But I wasn't thinking about separating any numbers among them. I campaigned for all of them, to such a point that none of their relations, the families, came to even join me outside the courts where I was demonstrating. One was Wells Street Court, and one was the other court in West London. And we had moved from Thames Magistrate Court, where the initial demonstrations took place, and then the venue kept being changed. So I acquitted them. I had them acquitted, 40 of them. Now, compared with the Notting Hill campaigning activists and anti-racists, that is how many times? More than 4 times as many. And I have not sought specific publicity about that series of events that I organized. So it would be like 4 times, 5 times as much importance being deserved by what I've done. I did in getting them freed or acquitted. And there was not one single licensed law trader who was offering their services. So, when I asked Ken Langston Livingstone all those questions, I didn't ask them for me. I asked them for the whole of London, of all people of all backgrounds and people affected by issues that the GLC had, various levels of duties to intervene. And very broadly speaking, the GLC was like a bigger version of a local council. It had the boundaries, it had the ward constituencies, and it had the mandate, the general democratic mandate. So when Tony Blair agreed to legislate for a mayor for London, I believe that Ken Langston Livingstone was killing himself with laughter and celebrating whatever way he does celebrate. Because he had managed to con Tony Blair out of any kind of movement towards a democratic, accountable structure for London. For example, in the current incumbent, Sadiq Khan, who is the 3rd individual to become mayor in the name of London, nobody has any clue what this person believes in. Sadiq Khan comes across as the perfect dummy. Now, who are the people that are running him? Well, he immediately after he elected in 2016, he got a very large number of white women put in positions everywhere, right, left, and center. And nobody knew why he did that. But he knew that by producing all these women around him, white women, he was coming across to the racists in the audience, in the communities, that he was not a Paki, that he was not going to be opposing, challenging racists. He was going to be their kind of agent rather than them being engaged in carrying out the mandate that the mayor should have carried out. And he staged his inaugural event in a cathedral, Sadak Cathedral. He could have chosen a neutral place, not a place of faith, but he was paying homage to his political masters and mistresses. So in London, we have got a completely unfit candidate opposing Sadiq Khan. I mean, Sean Bailey doesn't even exist as a mentionable political entity. And as the Guardian's John Crace says today, Boris Johnson didn't want somebody that could beat Sadiq Khan. Because Boris Johnson, according to John Crace in The Guardian, Boris Johnson preferred to remain the only conservative that could win. So that is the attraction. That is John Crace's reading. I cannot say that that is exactly what I think. I think that the Conservative Party, when it comes to London, when it comes to dealing with racism, is defeated by its own racism. Well, the Labour Party is racist as well, but the extent of Labour Party's racism is neutralized by the various activities that members of the black community or black people involved in the Labour Party managed to kind of carry out and organize. That is the only difference, I would say. But the Conservatives are so racist that the best that they can find are the worst in the equation among the population, among the demography. And the Conservatives are being penalized electorally in London because of their racism. I mean, to have somebody like Tory Siwa, Tory Siwa was given the platform by the apartheid-funded Voice newspaper for too long. And everything Tony Siwa wrote stank of racist servitude and nephew Tomism and so on. And to find him, along with the Pakistani origin, Niece Tom, who is the head of the policy unit for Johnson, to undermine an already weakened structure of opposing racism in this country, just does the job of showing that Boris Johnson is even worse racist than Donald Trump. How is that possible? Munira Mirza had already said the very same things a year prior to this so-called special commission report, said a year later. So it's ridiculous. The people who are writing about it and commenting, they don't even read the stuff. They don't even think about the evidence. And so therefore, Sadiq Khan can get away with being a dummy that he is. And he doesn't have to do anything to deliver any democracy, accountability, any structural changes, any fundamental changes in the governance of London in the definition that applies under the legislation that he is there in place for under. And there is no real London Assembly. It's a joke. For a start, the Labour Party had complete morons in the first few elections, including the complete, absolute racist slave, Trevor Terrible Phillips. Now, Trevor Terrible Phillips. Trevor Terrible Phillips and I go back decades. And I exposed him more than 40 years ago at the University of Sheffield. And he was gobsmacked. He couldn't answer my questions. Remember the point I make? When I ask questions, people I ask questions of cannot answer. And that's what I did to Trevor Terrible Phillips. And my supporters at the meeting at the University of Sheffield asked me, how did you do it? I didn't have a special secret to give them. I said, well, this is the evidence. I didn't kind of come prepared with those particular questions. But the evidence of his statements and whatever warranted those questions, and I knew that he couldn't answer. And he didn't answer. And from that time onwards, Trevor Terrible Phillips has a particular attention directed at me, which he did revive in 1992 when he plotted to launch this program from London Weekend Television called Devil's Advocate. And they decided to put me as the first test guest, the pilot program. And Terrible Phillips briefed Darcus Darty Howe on me and my kind of methods. And with one exception, during the program, I actually delivered exactly what I had delivered to Terrible Phillips's knowledge in the past. And that particular program remains not just the pilot program, but that remains the most kind of exhaustive and comprehensive evidence in the context of all of those crooks that were involved in the plot. They thought that they would actually neutralize my ethics and morality by inviting me there. But they didn't know the evidence of my actual work and my focus. I wasn't going to make up anything. And what I said to Darty Howe during that pilot has been noticed by somebody who wrote a book about him. And he actually quotes a short part of my denunciation of Darty Howe. And I called him that he was doing the dirty for the racists, which is what that book has quoted me as saying, which is fair enough. So Darcus Darty Howe and other legends of the kind of campaign against racism have been, on their evidence of their published thoughts, exposed as phonies, which is why I have had little agreements with any of them, not because I deliberately go out of my way to engender or encourage disagreements or controversies. It's because the evidence that they are based on or they're basing, their evidence doesn't support the truth and the morality and the ethics, which is why we are coming to discuss the mayor system. The mayor system that has been in place in Tower Hamlets and in Newham from the beginning was conceived to be a corrupt, dictatorial, anti-democratic, anti-social kind of platform given to a person of no morality and no ethics and no democracy and no commitment to society, which is what has happened. Because the first time that Newham got a borough-wide kind of, Newham became the first borough, let's say, with an elected mayor, was in 2002, 2 years after the mayor of London was kind of foisted in 2000. And the incumbent remained in post for 16 years. Robin Wales. Now, Wales arrived in Newham several years after I was active in Newham. I was active in Newham, in Waltham Forest and other places, across several boroughs in the east of London, or East London boroughs. So I knew East London for longer than Robin Wales. So when he and I came face to face on a live program that lasted half an hour, I mean, I could say to him that he didn't know Newham as much as I did, and so on. And my stance has always been to challenge those who are in power. And I don't challenge because shouting a slogan from the sidelines. I challenge absolutely upfront with evidence. This is something that is not done by anyone else because they have various weaknesses in terms of morality, in terms of evidence, and in terms of the ethics. And they've got a purpose. So they're either violent or unfit to sustain the engagement. And there have been many criminals employed by the crooks at the GLC under Ken Lang's Livingstone's, and also in the Inner London Education Authority. The crooks have got all kinds of backgrounds. They're either of Asian background or African background, or of Irish background, or of English background, whatever. Essentially, these people who control an office with no accountability expected of them, they can abuse those positions. And it is often the case that too long after the abuses, and there is an awareness that this happened all those years ago, it's too late. The damage has been done. So when the Greater London Assembly was kind of cooked up, it was confected in a way that it did not have any real teeth, which it doesn't. And there were too many of the say, if you like, or the kind of power on issues like the police and transport have been kept in the hands of the incumbent mayor. Now, Sadiq Khan is not the only inadequate person. Boris Johnson was as inadequate. Ken Livingstone was as inadequate. And I shall recap on some of these, the evidence of their conduct or misconduct. And I'm doing this to help anyone who is watching to realize that getting rid of the mayor system is absolutely the most important thing in Tower Hamlets and Newham today. And these are world exclusive evidential narrative updates and diagnoses that I'm making available on the record here on this one. When they had this Greater London Assembly, they had this as a decoration to make the incumbent mayor come across as if they have got a forum they are accountable to. They are not. Because when Livingstone was caught, during his second term, he had two 4-year terms. One from 2000 to 2004, and the last one was 2004 to 2008 when Johnson came in and replaced him. Now, when Livingstone became the subject of news, most of which was hostile to him, he blamed the media quite often, and he blamed some of the London Assembly members. But all these news items arose from his activities. For example, he allowed the abuse of money, the mayor's or the GLA's money, to be abused to fund his chums, whom he had given glorified titles, etc., etc. When they gave the money, Livingstone didn't bother about accountability, transparency, let alone honesty. And eventually these things became known, and they became the subject of coverage, particularly started by Andrew Gilligan, who began publishing stuff in the evening No Standard. But Livingstone said that Gilligan was politically hostile to him. That's why he was publishing those things. Now, that's not the case. Of course, Gilligan had ideological differences with Livingstone, and Gilligan, being an ex-employee at The Spectator, while Johnson was editor, would have wanted any dart on Ken Livingstone to stick. But the evidence was not a fiction. It wasn't made up by Gilligan. It was on the records of the GLA's abuse of money, etc., etc. And it wasn't just the abuse of money, it was the sexual misconduct and liaison between Lee Jasper and an Asian woman, whoever she was. It was titillizing, sensational, whatever. That became available to Gilligan, and he published them. And all those revelations had adverse impact on Livingstone's reputation and his integrity, as if he had any, but he obviously lost a lot. But this was after Livingstone created this incident when he attacked the right of this Jewish reporter. He was not a Jewish reporter. He was of Jewish identity, but he was not asking a question about the Jewish or non-Jewish. And this man, whose name is Oliver Finegold, asked Livingstone an innocent question. And Livingstone, instead of answering the question or ignoring it, exploded. And in a rage, he accused this Oliver Feingold, of behaving like the Nazis in Germany who were persecuting the Jews. Now that was not an anti-Jewish kind of statement in full, but the way and the context of Livingstone's use of the reference to the Jews and the comparison of this Jewish person with Nazis was unmistakably stupid, foolish, idiotic, and bore all apparent signs of Ken Livingston being very insensitive about the treatment of Jews by the Nazis, because he should not have called a Jewish person as behaving like the Nazis. I mean, that was completely out of order by any measure. But the fact that Livingstone thought he could say anything because he was the mayor of London, that is the point. He thought that he was above accountability, that he was immune, that he enjoyed an impunity from accountability for outrageous behavior and attitude and assertions, no matter how outrageous. Now, this is the impunity point that I will now take to the behavior of his successor, Boris Johnson, who benefited, of course, from that Oliver Feingold outburst by Livingstone. When Johnson began the affair with Jennifer Arcuri during the second of his two terms, that is 2012 until 2016, they were in a public place in London somewhere. And Johnson attempted to kiss Jennifer Arcuri. And even though she was clearly his mistress and they were having an adulterous relationship, because Marina Warner was still married to Johnson and Johnson vice versa to her, Marina Warner, that is. Livingstone had not had any known kind of adulterous affair, but Johnson was, of course, notorious. So when they were in the public place and Johnson tried to kiss her, Jennifer Arcuri, even Arcuri felt that there was a moral line, a line that needed to be preserved. And she said to him that, look, we are in a public place. And the defiant Johnson said, I don't care. I am the mayor. This is my city. That is contained in her, Jennifer Arcuri's disclosures only now, which she made in March this year to the Daily Mirror group. But the fact that he did that, he did say that he would have said that, has not been doubted by a single person. And that is the unfitness that is evident in the holder of a post called the mayor, who assumes impunity from all standards and facts of accountability. Now, if he is doing that as the owner of a business, private business, that is not the same thing as the same behavior while being imposed to the mayor in the name of London. And the budget of the mayor, it's the mayor that actually influences and makes the most decisions. And the London Assembly does the token thing of rubber stamping. In the case of the boroughs, directly elected mayors, it's the mayor who makes the decisions. Even if the council doesn't agree with him, makes no difference. Because the mayor, he or she, has the absolute kind of discretion to make any decision. So in Tower Hamlets, during the 6 calendar years of the incumbency of Lutfur Rahman, each year Tower Hamlets had access to a budget or the amount of money in excess of £1 billion. So let's say £6 billion. Now, people who don't know Asia or Asian countries, I mean, £6 billion over a period of 6 years is very significant amount of money in local currencies. And nobody, even the head of a state in Asia, would have had such control over the allocation of that kind of money. And yet, one of only 32 boroughs, you say, well, one of only 32 boroughs, there is 32 boroughs make up London, Greater London. And this is only one borough, Tower Hamlets. And somebody from a borough like that small part of London can have such big amount of money at their disposal. If they look back on their country of origin, it would be staggering, which it was. And as the accountants appointed by Eric Pickles as the Secretary of State at the time into the behavior, financial behavior of Tower Hamlets, found out they didn't investigate everything. And that was to do with the limited kind of terms of reference that Eric Pickles gave them. But even with the limited terms of reference, they came up with evidence of misconduct and misbehavior and misuse of funds by Lutfur Rahman. And one of the most extraordinary findings that the accountants published was the fact that Lutfur Rahman abused his position to fund unverified applicants huge sums of money compared to in the context. He gave money to dozens of organizations that did not deserve money, the council's money, because none of those organizations to this day has been found to have delivered anything to the communities. These are secret cabals that existed to provide Lutfur Rahman one thing: timely delivery of votes from their networks that they had set up with the particular purpose of delivering votes to Lutfur Rahman. Now that was a series of criminality. And as I've said before, the two main statutes. One is dated 1968 and the other is dated 1978. Both acts are called Theft Act. According to both of those, Lutfur Rahman committed crimes in those allocations of grants. Why? Because one or two organizations that he gave the grants to had not even applied. That is how total Lutfur Rahman's sense of impunity was, or whoever advised him gave him the idea that he could do that. Now, we're talking about hundreds of millions of pounds. Well, 6 billion plus 7 billion, 8 billion over 6 calendar years that Lutfur Rahman had access to over 6 calendar years. But even if it's 6 calendar years, and if it is only a billion plus every year, it is a lot of money. Now, looking at the behavior of the council while Lutfur Rahman was incumbent, that actually took action against people and took away money, benefit, and so on from people that were then cast into poverty and hardship and severe losses, it is possible to see that Lutfur Rahman's 6 calendar years were spent as a gangster having access to the billions of pounds that belonged to somebody else. And he was doing whatever he liked. The only thing that he needed was a series of covers to cover his wrongdoings. But he was continuing to do wrongs because individual councillors were not entitled to ask him questions or demand answers or accountability, etc., etc. How do I know that? Because as the MP, Robert Neil, disclosed in the House of Commons in a short debate that he organized in January 2013, Lutfur Rahman was being aided and abetted by a woman called Isabella Freeman. Now, Isabella Freeman was in post as the monitoring officer and as the head of the legal, in-house legal section of the council. And she was not doing it in private. She was brazenly harassing people on the council, councillors who were critical of Lutfur Rahman. And she was hiring private investigators at cost to the council to harass any of the councillors that dared criticize Lutfur Rahman's behavior. So that's the behavior of a dictator, which is a criminal anyway. So that was all of it could have been avoided if we didn't have in Tower Hamlets an elected mayor post foisted in October 2010, but it was foisted. Now, I am the longest standing and the most consistent commentator against the elected mayor post. And I am on the record as having written and spoken, I would now say, hundreds of thousands of words against the mayor system, which I cannot do in a program like this of this length. But suffice to say that everything I've said, everything I said would happen, bad things would happen in Tower Hamlets, if an elected mayor was imposed, has happened. And one of the things that has happened is this extraordinary image of Tar Hamlets that has been created over these 4 girls, Bethnal Green schoolgirls, that were allowed to be brainwashed and groomed and trafficked to the so-called Islamic State in Syria. And that was only possible because the council was not active in delivering its own duties. What are the duties? The duties are contained in the general expression. You can look it up. Safeguarding children duties. Now that can be anything. And anything ranging from any level of urgency and danger. Safeguarding, of course, implies there is danger involved. And this could not be more dangerous. How can anyone in their right minds think that anyone should be sent to a war zone under whatever cover? I mean, what is that going to do to anyone's life? A war zone, which is where these children were sent. And as the entry, or as a number of entries in the Wikipedia confirm, the connection between the East London Mosque and at least one of these girls, Sharmina Begum, who actually was the first one to go to Syria in December 2014. The connection is very clear. The Sharmina was brainwashed in the East London Mosque. And East London Mosque is one of the places which form the main kind of support logistics, if you like, framework for the imposition of the mayor post and for the progressing into incumbency in that post by Lutfur Rahman. In other words, Lutfur Rahman knew the people in the East London Mosque, not necessarily those individuals doing the brainwashing of Sharmina Begum, but the people who control the committees, etc., etc. Even if he didn't know, he should have known the duty that the council owed to the community. And if that kind of duty was being carried out by the Tar Hamlets Council, then Lutfur Rahman should have known that there was a series of dangers, if you like, concerning the welfare and well-being and safety of these girls. To this day, there has been no statement by Tar Hamlets Council about what it did or didn't do to safeguard those 4 girls. One, Sharmina Begum, who went in December 2014, and the other 3, Shamima Begum, and the other 2, went in February 2015, which is only 3 months apart. And when they went to the same destination, they met up with this other girl. So even if they didn't have direct connection with the East London Mosque, they had connection with somebody who had been the victim of brainwashing by the East London Mosque-based personnel. So when the news became public that these girls had crossed into Syria, Tar Hamlets Council must have noticed that this was the news, and it must have issued a statement or must have done something to find out what happened to these girls and how to recover them back to Britain. There is no trace of any statement being made by the Armed Council about any of these. Now, the fact that these girls were only in the news in February 2015 for the first time doesn't mean that they were only in contact with these brainwashers. At that time, the brainwashing, the process must have been going on for a significant amount of time before that. And if the council was active in safeguarding the children, it would have been aware of these brainwashing and communications and whatever. But we can't say what our Ambulance Council did at any of those points because there is no publicly available statement or record of what the council did or didn't do. We know that council didn't do anything because there have been other statements, including statements belatedly made after our consistent questioning which we haven't been making by any contact with any licensed law trader or anybody else who has been publicly speaking about these girls. We make all our comments and observations entirely based on independently obtained and published sources. So we are doing the objective questioning in running the campaign for justice for these girls. But we are doing that with no contact with the girls, their families, or anybody else connected with them. So we are making the public demands that our Ambulance Council must make available and make public the evidence of what it did or didn't do to help these girls. Now, the fact that there has been a mayor in place for all these 11 years means that we cannot ask any councillor. Because if we ask any councillor, they would say it's the mayor who owns the council, in effect. And that is true. So it's not just dictatorship, it's a criminal gang that has been foisted on the council under this post, and it must be got rid of. And we shall be talking more about these girls and other serious criminality done by the regimes of the mayors. 6 calendar years Lutfur Rahman, and the last year since June 2015 by John Biggs. Now, if we then go back to Newham, and we're talking about these mayor post holders on the very day that this post can be disposed of by people voting against the mayor system. When I was using a public facility, I had to pay for access, but it was a public facility with access to computers and internet. On the 14th of March 2018, I got a call on the mobile contact phone, not necessarily the one that I'm using now, but contact phone that I was using on the day. I got a call from the person who presented a program on a satellite channel to the effect that in a few minutes' time, Robin Wales was due to come to the studio and appear live on the program. Now, the message I got wasn't a straightforward, humble request for me to join them. It was asking me to give this person some hints and some tips as to how to talk to Robin Wales while Robin Wales came live, came on air. How could I do that? That's impossible. So, one of the things I do, and I have done over a very long time, is I do produce things that other people who don't know the actual circumstances of where I'm doing something think that I'm being backed by fully fledged funds and resources. It has hardly been the case. It is completely impossible to do the kind of rigorous campaigns that I do and then be fully funded. Nobody would fund anyone like me doing the kind of rigorous investigating and advocacy and questioning, because my questions are unanswerable, as I have said, not because they are not answerable, but they are unanswerable by the guilty ones. Now, this one was asking me something that is impossible. I could not tell them over the telephone what to say to Robin Wales because I wasn't witnessing them. So I didn't know what was happening between them in terms of exchange. So the short of it was that I decided to go to the studio and join Robin Wales. And that happened on the 14th of March 2018. Essentially, Robin Wales couldn't answer my questions, which is the theme. Now, but he could dodge the questions. And while he had been in post for 16 years as the incumbent mayor at the expense of Newham people, he obviously successfully evaded all the councillors, 60 odd elected councillors in Newham. Otherwise, he would not have been in post for 16 years. The fact that a single person, political career, whatever the post they hold, could dodge 60 elected councillors for 16 years shows the extent of the authoritarian powers available to an incumbent mayor. It's far more sweeping than a dictator can ordinarily command. So what they did was to allow Robin Wales 16 years of impunity from accountability. And he did that in the way that he approached the questions I was asking him. He was lying, of course, and he was making excuses. Now, I had no previous warning or notice prior to that phone call. So I had no time to do any fundamental updated research on his behavior. So when I appeared on the program live, I did that based on general contextual knowledge about his role, etc., etc. But essentially, I focused on the constitutional behavior. And he promised that he didn't do the things that he could have done, according to my questions, because he was legally advised against those things, and those things that I wanted him to answer on included him taking the Conservative government to court, challenging the Conservative government's policies that affected him delivering or failing to deliver on housing. So Wales promised that he would send me copy or copies of the advice, the legal advice that he claimed had been received by him and given to him against taking court action against the government. And for 6 weeks after that, until the election of the 3rd of May 2018, when he was no longer in post, Robin Wales failed to answer any of the emails and he failed to send the promised documents. And during the promise that he made on air, on the live program with me, in answer to my question that he would not be able to substantiate this claim that he was prevented by legal advice from taking court action against the government, he said, I never say anything that I cannot back up. That's what he said. And he obviously said a lot of things on that program he could never back up and he would never have the intention of backing up. That's what he did. To this day, I have not received any legal advice, but let me hasten to say, I don't need his copy of the legal advice because I know the law better than any of his advisors. And the law is that there is absolutely no barrier to a local council or a council's representatives seeking de facto judicial review. It doesn't have to be called judicial review. We're seeking an intervention of a court, properly constituted court. And that is something that I elaborated on by referring to the contextual role and framework available through the Magna Carta. Nothing to do with the current squabbles about Europe and European imposed legislation, etc., etc. I went back hundreds of years. And I referred to 2 cases, but the main one was the case that was brought against Jack Straw and was deliberated on by the Supreme Court in January 2017. And I referred to one part of the ruling by the Supreme Court that contained an explicit quotation from the Magna Carta. And that is what I put to Robin Wales on the program. Now, I had not taken any of the copies with me or whatever. I just did that from general awareness of these things. And Robin Wales couldn't answer. Now, that is against me, against my questioning. I'm not expecting anybody else to be of the same awareness or ability or intellectual preparedness generally. But there are other ordinary duties and things that do not have to be of this caliber and quality for the locally elected council to deliver on. And all of those ordinary duties and things have been let down by Tower Hamlets being foisted, lumbered with an elected councillor post, elected mayor post, and Newham, of course, for a longer period. And the leaflets that have been available this week about this one, for example, which is the one that is published from Newham. The contents of these leaflets, they may appear to be kind of quite forward and up to date and democratic and rigorous, but they're not. So I go back to the point I made about Winston Churchill not getting to the actual operation of democracy. Because if they change the mayor system in Newham and Tower Hamlets, or if they change it in one place, and after the formal kind of procedures are undertaken and the preferred system is established, preferred system that is not the incumbency of a elected mayor, then that would not necessarily deliver democracy. What would be needed to establish any semblance of democracy and accountability in the Bara concerned, Newham or Tower Hamlets or both, depending on the result, I cannot predict what the result would be. So the actual behavior of the council in the new form would be connectable with the delivery of democracy and accountability, on condition that the elected councillors are actually vigilant and do their job and ask questions, put questions to the council's establishment about all the issues that the council exists to deliver to the community. If they do that, then democracy will come somewhere near being alive and undergoing delivery. Otherwise, it would not make the necessary difference to the causes of the people, hundreds of people or thousands of people in the bara, each bara, being let down, betrayed, misrepresented, and neglected at various levels. What will happen in the next part today, I'll read some of the communications and articles and statements and questions that I put to Robin, well, not Robin Wells so much as Roxana Fias, and to Luthuraman and to John Biggs. And so therefore, until that time, we are now coming to just 2 minutes to midday on Thursday, the 6th of May, 2021. So we shall stop this just short of 2 minutes short of midday, and then we shall come back with part C.